The new Netflix limited series Eric is heavily influenced by when and where the action takes place. The dramatic crime thriller stars a talented cast led by Benedict Cumberbatch as a puppeteer named Vincent whose son goes missing in New York City. Vincent spirals out of control as his desperation increases, and to cope with the grief he befriends an imaginary 7-foot-tall puppet, the show's eponymous Eric, which was created by his son, Edgar. Along the way, the main character's search for Eric leads them down a path lined with all the societal ills rampant in NYC. The show's setting, both in location and time period, helps to drive the show's overarching narrative. In some ways, the setting acts as a character unto itself, as much a part of the story as Cumberbatch's volatile puppeteer Vincent or any of the other major characters. The occasionally overstuffed Eric can be considered a period piece, as the now distant but still familiar time period in which the story is set actually sets up most of the conflict presented in the 6-episode miniseries. However, it can be tough to pin down an exact time frame for the casual binge watcher. Netflix's Eric takes place in 1985. The show is rife with period references. Eric establishes its 1980s New York City setting right away from a visual perspective. The level of technology, hairstyling and clothing all make it apparent that the show takes place at least a couple of decades in the past, but that isn't quite enough to pin down an actual date for the show's action. The first episode's references to AIDS provides a bit more clarity, especially given the show's New York City setting. New York City was the city most affected by the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. McKinley Belcher III's detective Michael LeDroit puts a definitive timestamp on the show in the first episode as well, as he is shown writing the date April 30, 85 on paper. The overall 1980s aesthetic is clear enough, but the specificity of 1985 matters to the show's narrative. In 1985, the AIDS epidemic was in full swing in NYC along with other societal problems like rampant homelessness, homophobia, and political corruption. These elements all contribute to the overall story that Eric is trying to tell, so setting the show smack dab in the middle of the 1980s makes sense. How Eric's 1980s setting sets up the Netflix show. The story is driven by the culture of 1980s New York City. Benedict Cumberbatch as Vincent sitting next to Ivan Morris house Edgar on a subway train in Eric. The 1985 setting is important to Edgar's disappearance. The lack of technology compared to modern times makes his vanishing a realistic, plausible problem. In the age of Ring cameras on every doorbell and Find My Phone apps, a child disappearing in New York City would at least have some semblance of a trail to pursue. In 1985, however, it's unsurprising that a 9-year-old boy could vanish with a trace while walking to school. Furthermore, the prevalence of puppets in the story makes a lot more sense given the 1985 setting. Vincent's hit TV show Good Day Sunshine is a very overt stand-in for similar popular kids' shows of the 1980s like Sesame Street, Fraggle Rock and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Vincent's career as a puppeteer and the prevalence of puppets in general feel fitting in 1985, where the same concept and plot points would feel out of place if the show were set even 10 years later. Outside of Edgar's disappearance, the other storylines all revolve around the aforementioned problems plaguing New York City in 1985. While one part of Eric deals with Vincent's unraveling mind and his reliance on Eric, another part digs deep into Detective LeDroit's struggles to remain closeted as a detective in the missing persons unit. Another part examines the rampant homelessness and police brutality, and still another part points out government corruption in the city. Each separate element of Eric can only exist cohesively thanks to the show's specific setting in 1985.